Yo, hello. We are back once again with another Grail tier list update, this time for the month of March, and I ended up missing February because ever since they added the Marth emblem, I didn't want to really rush any updates because I figured there would be a lot of stuff to talk about on there. I wanted it to digest a bit, but because of that, there's 2 months worth of updates to go over, and to not make this a really bloated video, I'm going to try and condense it as much as possible, and because of the timing of this video, I'm also going to be covering Gangrel's Refine as well. But it's pretty much going to be the same par for the course stuff. I'm going to go over 3 tier lists, one for Aether raids, one for Summoner Duels, and one for Arena, and based on the cumulative ranking on each individual placement of said unit, will ultimately determine what units I end up recommending at the end of the video. Max investment is also considered, and you can easily take each of these lists on their own individual basis if you are looking for specific projects for certain modes, but just keep in mind that if you do see a lot of the stat comparisons or a lot of the effects, some of them may be a bit more skewed because the amount of resources that you may need for some units will definitely be greater or lesser than some other modern ones. If you have any feedback or questions, leave them in the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I can. For now, we may as well get right into the Aether raids tier list, which has a lot of updates to go through. We got 7 Grail units, some that have refines, some that were added to the game, brand new mythics and legendaries. We have Emblem Marth, which is a really big one, and a lot of brand new effects and skills that are definitely going to skew a lot of what Aether raids offense and defense is going to be looking like. Now, as far as the new units and refines are concerned, we have stuff such as Young Minerva, Desert Hawkeye, and Pern, who came out in January. Minerva got a passive breath effect that can be granted to every single ally within 2 spaces. She has slang, she gets full no follow-up on top of extra stats. Generally, I think this is probably where she's going to shine the most, because as far as Aether raid's offense strategies are concerned, a lot of them have leaned into Gale Force strategies or hit and run, depending on the unit you're using. Minerva basically being an upgraded version of Gnaw by granting everybody the breath effect, while also being able to Gale Force in their own capacity is very useful. On top of flyer benefits such as guidance and snap for extra range, I honestly think she's one of the better units that you could build up for something like Aether raids if you are looking for a Gale Force niche. Meanwhile, with Hawkeye, he's pretty much just a generic lance, except he's a lot more min-max in the defensive capabilities, so you'll pretty much just use him either as a tank, which I don't necessarily recommend at the moment, or you'll use him for Gale Force strategies for Wings of Mercy follow-up. You can still run Arcane Chiang with the Marth emblem and maybe something like Pulse Up, so you could get a really low cooldown special, and then with somebody like Asker, or depending on what season you're using him on, you can have pretty much an instantaneous Gale Force, and you really won't have to worry about the cooldown whatsoever because Chiang also has breath built into it. Meanwhile, with Pern, he has a player phase Brave Dagger that has breath and grants null penalties. You can pretty much think of him as a free-to-play legendary Shez, except he doesn't have the effectiveness against all. That being said, having her entire PRF as a weapon is incredibly good in its own right. He has the ability to spam specials because he can run stuff such as Speed Defense Tempo 4, which will guarantee low cooldown specials, or even 3 cooldown specials if you run Emblem Marth. Fatal Smoke 4, so you can get around stuff such as Miracle. Having passive Shred, you could be able to also run stuff such as Remote Sparrow, so you could go up against units that may hit back, because he isn't particularly bulky in any sense. Generally, you'll probably just be running him on an Igren line, and I'll get into that a bit later, but generally speaking, he is a very solid Aether raids defense unit, and if you want somebody with high nuking potential, you'll have a really good time with him. You also have the likes of Ashnard, who got a recent refine in Gagurant, and a brand new generic armor in Vigard. Ashnard, in my opinion, I think has a lot of potential, but some of the effects that he did get in his weapon, I would call borderline useless. For example, follow-up denial isn't exactly that useful in any sense of the word, because a lot of units nowadays either have some sort of offensive no follow-up, or a lot of units will give it out passively through guidance support, even somebody like Ashnard himself. That being said, I think as far as his good supportive capabilities are concerned, he does inflict lull attack defense within 4 spaces, as well as guard, which can be really beneficial for shutting off Gale Force strategies, and because he is a flyer, he can still sit there and it provides soaring guidance support if you want allies to teleport in. Personally, I would have definitely traded out the follow-up denial for something like a guaranteed follow-up, because his combat is very much lacking. He does get a lot of daunt, aka he debuffs a lot of attack and defense, but I don't think that's really going to mean much at the end of the day, since there's no guarantee that he's going to be able to get off specials or a lot of damage out whatsoever, especially since he lacks Shred and the ability to double on a consistent basis. But I think as far as support goes, you can put him on an Aether raids defense, and you can either stop a lot of Gale Force strategies because of the guard effect, or you can make it easier for units to survive on an Aether raids defense setting. Meanwhile, with Vigard, he's pretty much just a standard melee armor. You would pretty much run him the same way as you would a lot of other axe armors. There's nothing really too special here. He does what he needs to do. He has high defense. He can run Arcane Threma with Pavis, or even run the Emblem Marth, so you can have a 1 cooldown Pavis, Hardy Fighter, and Near Save. He should be pretty much good to go on that front. And lastly, we also have the likes of Mavier and Gangrel. Mavier is a pretty decent support buff because he grants 2 bonuses, so if you were to run somebody with Prime or even Prime on himself, then you could easily enable it, especially on himself, who could get 3 visible bonuses for pretty much free. That being said, I think he works best as a support, mainly because he's giving out a lot of bonuses and because he's in an archetype that can run a fair amount of skills that further supports an Aether Raid's offense strategies. If you were to use him for Gale Force strategies or anything on O besides support, I'd probably recommend Chiang, just because there's a lack of player face niches for his archetype that isn't Gale Force. But generally speaking, I think he works better as a support, and I would definitely keep him as that. And lastly, with Gangrel, he got 11 Dagger Refine, which is basically a side grade void that has built-in Hexblade, true damage, and 30% DR on initiation, and you can pretty much run them in the same way you would run Pern on an infantry line, and I'll get into that in a second, with the likes of stacking damage reduction skills, speed defense tempo 4, and pledge, so that way you could guarantee a lethality on every second hit, assuming the foe counters back, and because his weapon inflicts guard, they won't be able to trigger a special unless it's instant, or they have no guard in their kit somewhere. And overall, I don't think it's bad by any means. You probably wouldn't want to give him Void because of a lot of the skills he has access to, but it's more or less just going to be a side grade of that. Now, in terms of Aether Raid's updates that are probably worth mentioning a lot, we have the likes of Safi, who is pretty much a blessable Freyr in the sense that it gets rid of all sorts of penalties, which means you could go back and run stuff such as Katria because she does get rid of the Schism effect. And it's not in the same sense of Freyr where it removes the triangle attack. This works exactly like odd and even recovery, so you'll be able to at least get brave attacks going from there. Which is worth mentioning if you are looking for some kind of niche for a lot of your infantry ranged units. You also have Gren, who grants extra movement, and you can pretty much use this in the same vein as you would use Hinoka. You would pretty much just grant a bunch of infantry extra movement, and you'll be able to get a lot of threat range that way. And New Year's Aether is pretty much just a blessable version of Aether. You run her on a Gale Force team, and you should be able to shut off a lot of allies as long as you are able to get in range of them, which really shouldn't be that big of an issue. So for anybody struggling on Aether Raid's defense setting, you probably want to build around her if possible. We also have the likes of Tina, Lumera, and Emblem Marth. Tina, in my opinion, definitely works best on an Aether Raid's offense setting because you'll be able to steal on guard from Amedius and the team, making them vulnerable to the likes of Bolt Tower, which in my opinion is extremely valuable for just setting up Gale Force strategies or just getting in and being able to secure kills with no issue whatsoever. You also have the likes of Lumera, who absolutely contributes to that too because she has a very high range tempo effect. You won't be able to get guarded. If you have a breath effect, you'll be able to secure it a lot more often. And even though she is a dragon, you could still use her for smite bot stuff if you just want to get units in with relative ease. I think her ability to grant tempo, as far as I'm concerned, is very, very useful. And as for Emblem Marth, there is a whole nother video where I go over his effectiveness and just what you could do with his emblem ring, but the general gist of it is that he impacts a lot because of the additional slang effect. This works for defensive units or even offensive units for something like Gale Force or Blazing Winds or anything of the sort. Really, there's only so much I can say that hasn't already been said to a lot of people. We also have the likes of Arcane Thunder, Dual Leon, and Selena. Arcane Thunder is pretty much just going to be another buff for your Blue Tome generic, so they can at least function in a much higher capacity than they were before. No follow-up, breath, low speed res. You got the gist of it. It's a pretty good weapon. Dual Leon, while he has a much bigger presence in something like Summoner Duels, is probably going to be a bit annoying for the likes of Aether Raid's offense too, because you'll be able to still use it for Gale Force strategies, shut off specific units. You can run him in the Wings of Mercy comp, and he has sweep and end turn smoke and whatever the case may be. On top of his button, which will almost secure what you need to secure a lot of the time, you're going to have to be careful with him because he's very, very obnoxious. And speaking of obnoxious, inheritable layer damage in the form of Devoted Basket, which in my opinion made so many red tomes viable for nuking prowess because you just pretty much get 30 plus free damage for initiating combat. There's no protection against it, you can't DR it, you can't do anything, you just have to eat all the attack. And lastly, we have Mur and Legendary Alir. Mur brings Candy Fighter, which is basically just a Weaving Fighter equivalent for your mages and dragons, which is a nice buff for the ones that really couldn't take advantage of it initially. You could use it for miracle strats if you have the breath effect. And Legendary Alir bringing Dragon's Roar means that you can have some more defensive properties for your dragons, especially the ones that have a decent amount of res, because it works equivalently to the likes of Armored Beacon and Flow. Should pretty much say it all. It's a really nice special to have around, but I don't think it's going to be something that helps out a lot of enemy phase issues because right now it's just kind of down in the dumps, especially now that we have the likes of Arcane Charmer and Soaring Echo, which is a really good buff for staves as well as flyers. I mainly want to focus on Soaring Echo because now you have a free C slot which can be used for either granting more support or improving your own individual combat, so you're not just sitting there doing nothing besides providing guidance. An Arcane Charmer is pretty much just arcane for stabs and relatively par for the course, but it's still a nice buff regardless. That being said, I think in terms of general buffs, you're pretty much just going to see a lot of rise when it comes to Gale Force strategies as well as red tomes. I think Marth is an incredibly beneficial tool for Aether Raid's offense, especially for the units that can have really high movement or acceleration gimmicks such as Arcane Chiang. The ones that were able to do it before probably were already in the solid tier anyway because they had enough accessible tools for them to really function, but for the ones that really weren't doing it before, now they have Emblem Marth and it's so much more consistent, which is why you're also seeing a massive promotion in the likes of a lot of Lance Cavs and a lot of Lance Flyers. But you also have the likes of Arret and Groom Robin who have access to Devoted Basket, Flared Mirror, and Occultist Strike, which again is just a bunch of free damage and true damage. So even in the scenario where the foe is able to just tank with a naturally high amount of res, you're still going to be able to deal so much damage just because you're getting true damage from Occultist Strike on top of all the free damage there. Although of course you also have your infantry units that can use it, such as Peleus. That being said, they won't be able to get the likes of Flared Sparrow or Flared Mirror because of their movement type, but they can still run stuff such as Blazing Wind, Pulse Up Blades, and with Marth Emblem they will be able to have it on every second turn, assuming you have some sort of pulse support. And this is probably the next best thing anyway, because you're getting AoE damage on top of free flare damage on top of true damage. Generally speaking, I think they're going to be doing extremely well for the time being because of their massive threat range, especially with the likes of Igren, who could grant infantry extra movement. I think overall there's a lot of buffs both for offense and defense, so you really have to be careful, and if anything, I think this is just going to push more people into going into Gale Force options. And because of that, I feel that Har, Cormag, and Shez are probably the next units to demote. One of their biggest contributions at the time was being able to run a Soren Ball team where they would be near saving and providing guidance support, but if a lot of the meta is going down Gale Force strategies, and a lot of them usually end up going in turn 1, then their effectiveness is definitely going to be a lot more shot. I definitely do think they can work in the right scenarios. But even that aside, I also promoted some of the sword calves as well as blue tomes and bows. The sword calves can take advantage of the likes of Lumera's tempo, so they can easily charge up Gale Force if needed. I'm not really worried about it on that front, especially now that tempo is such a free effect on light season. And with the likes of the blue tomes, they should be able to replicate a fair amount of what the red tomes are doing, except they won't be getting a lot of the free flare damage, but they do get extra true damage as a result of it. And you can still run the same stuff as you were doing before, and you should be completely good to go. Marth Emblem also helps out a lot of the other units that have the likes of Arcane Thrima, because Arcane Thrima having Slaying, Marth granting Slaying, and then getting extra pulse support, you should be able to get an instant Gale Force as long as you're able to make a Heavy Blade check, which should be incredibly easy for most of them. And just like with all the other infantries on the list, you're going to be running a lot of the bows in a similar vein on an Igren line. What you could do here is run Golden Yule Bow, so you'll get an instant Deadeye, and for Astra Season in particular, you can run Marth Emblem, and it will get around Veil's Scowl effect because it only reduces it by 1. Golden Yule Bow will give you a flat 3, so Deadeye will still be able to get an instant charge and kill. And lastly on the list, there's Lissa, and this is mostly because of Arcane Charmer having Breath built into it and Canny Fighter granting damage reduction. So if you need a far save with good bulk to just survive on an enemy phase team, or an Aether Raid's defense setting, she'll be able to do it with pretty good ease. That being said, you'll be dumping a lot of her offensive gimmicks because of it, which I think is perfectly fine. And lastly, for the Aether Raid's list updates, this is pretty much just going to be the same list as it was before when it comes to what season or defense setting or offense setting that you should pretty much use most of these units on. A lot of them pretty much fall into the same category, but somebody like Gangrel and Pern or any of the infantry units probably want to go on an Anima season, mainly because you won't be able to shut off Igren's extra movement with Freyr being there. But otherwise, a lot of it just falls into the same archetypes. Your generics fall into the same lane as a lot of the other ones. Some are good buff bots, some are really good in the Aether Raid's defense setting, pretty much what you would expect from a lot of these units. Next, there's the Summoner Duels update, and a lot of it does fall in line with what a lot of the Aether Raids ones were. You have Emblem Marth, who grants additional slaying effects to pretty much everybody, which is beneficial for both player phase options and defensive options. You have Devoted Basket, which is free damage and gets through a lot of tanks. Not a lot of the newer ones if you don't have good attack, but getting free flare damage, especially on your flyers, who could also run Soaring Echo, by the way. It makes it so they could be a lot more useful beyond just providing guidance support. Dueleon continues to be an absolute terror because of his end turn smoke and button that also ends turns, so you'll have to definitely watch out for something like that, but at the moment he's really difficult to deal with, so I definitely recommend that if you end up running into him, for at least for Summoner Duels S, you just ban the team because he's going to be a nightmare to deal with otherwise, or you just try to outrange him first because that's pretty much the name of the game. If you can get rid of them, you'll pretty much be good. Igran also is another addition to the likes of Cavalry Lines, except now you can pretty much do it for infantry. You just run more Pathfinder support, she grants extra movement. You have other units copy it, such as Brave Crom, and it's pretty much the same copy paste as it once was, except she has really good combat. And Winter Byleth alongside Valentine's Mart are still going to be your two prevalent armors, one who's just an incredibly tanky unit who could also take advantage of Null C Vantage strats, and the other one who has anti-warp shenanigans as well as scout and very min-max bulk. Overall, these are probably some of the most threatening units that you have to worry about at the moment. But going into our Grail updates, Young Minerva, Hawkeye, and Pern, they all have relative niches that you can definitely take advantage of, although it's mainly going to be Pern and Minerva. Infantry melee aren't exactly in a great spot at the moment, and in my opinion aren't really that great for something like Summoner Duels because they lack the threat range and utility that a lot of other archetypes have over them. Young Minerva can pretty much do the same thing as a lot of other melee flyers were doing. They could sit there, be annoying, but she has the benefit of doing a lot of damage because she has no follow-up and instant no quarter procs. She can run Soaring Echo and provide snap support so that you can also have extra movement if your warping isn't going to be able to take advantage of. Hawkeye is a melee infantry, but he is relatively min-max, so at the very least you could probably run something like Bulwark frontlining with far save support in the back, but you'll definitely have to be careful because he isn't infallible. And again, being a melee infantry doesn't really do him a lot of favors. Meanwhile, with Pern, he's just a really good player phase nuke. He has Blade Royale, which is, again, just a copy-paste version of Legendary Shez's weapon, but he doesn't have the effective against all. That being said, he can still run the likes of Speed Defense Tempo, Fatal Smoke, Blade Session, and Fleeting Echo, so he should have a relatively decent time at initiating and killing in the player phase. You'll have to watch out for the likes of Byleth and Myrrh because they will absolutely destroy him if he doesn't kill. Other than that, he should have a relatively decent nuking prowess niche. On top of the fact that he also grants null penalties to everybody, he has a little bit of something going on for him. You also have the likes of Ashnard and Vigard. I think this is where Ashnard succeeds a lot more, mainly because all he has to do is sit there and provide guidance support, but because of the amount of extra bulk that he grants to pretty much every single save armor due to low attack defense, on top of the fact that he could also run hold and whatever else may be just so he could be a really bulky frontliner, he's honestly going to be succeeding a lot more than a lot of the other Grail melee flyers in my opinion, especially since he doesn't necessarily rely on DR a lot of the time. Even though he has DR built into him, he has a really good defense stat on top of the amount of attack debuffs he already provides. I think he's going to be doing a lot of good work in something like Summoner Duels. But Guard, he's still a generic armor, which pretty much par for the course. You run Aegis with Marth Emblem and Arcane Threma, and Distant Counter melee, so as long as you're able to counter back, he should be doing relatively good work against a lot of units that aren't named Hinoka. And as for Mavir and Gangrel, I think this is where Mavir is going to be doing a bit more work, mainly because Summoner Duels definitely doesn't benefit a lot of units that can only do one specific thing. And because he's able to provide a decent amount of support and has decent combat in his own right, on top of being able to access No Quarter and the Marth Emblem, you'll pretty much run him like every other melee cav, but he does have the benefit of providing support. I think he'll do an okay amount of work, but he's definitely somebody that you're probably not going to be prioritizing for the mode, mainly because the support that he does give is definitely more beneficial for meeting Prime's conditions than it would be for actual effects in my opinion. Mainly because everything is so min-maxed, I don't really see the benefit of Hexblade as I once did. No Panic is still pretty decent in its own right though. And as for Gangrel, he pretty much is going to be another catch your ball nuke. He has all the infantry goodies, he's ranged. What more could you really want? He's pretty much just going to be running a side grade Arcane Void, and that's all you're really going to need from him. He does have damage reduction in his weapon, and he can run Fleeting Echo, so his ability to eat hits is definitely a lot higher than a lot of other units in the Grail shop. But if you still run into Byleth or Myrrh, they're going to destroy him if he doesn't kill. And really, as far as the tier list updates are concerned, I think the two refines that we did get on top of Pern existing definitely meet the criteria for superb in my opinion. I think all three of them provide a really good amount of stuff to where I would definitely recommend them in the mode if you do have the Grails lying around. But in a similar vein, I also demoted the likes of Eldigan and Larm, mainly because the tanking color isn't exactly beneficial and they don't have the same defensive gimmick as Cormac, who has true damage reduction. They can still provide dance support, but with the amount of shred that we have in the game at this point, I'm really skeptical on their ability to frontline as much as a lot of the other units. And for the ones that are still up there and don't have those gimmicks, they still have other stuff that they can provide, including Arian with Charge, Minerva who has Breath, a lot of speed and no follow-up, and Shez who has built-in cancel, which allows him to do stuff that a lot of other units in his archetype aren't really really able to replicate at this time. But otherwise, I pretty much just promoted Zephiel because 1 cooldown Aegis with the Distant Counter Seal and Arcane should do a lot of work for pretty much most melee armors. And just like I mentioned earlier, there's the ability to run all sorts of free flare damage because of Devoted Basket, which is why I ended up promoting a lot of the red mages. You also have the likes of Dragons who could still run Dragon's Roar and Speed Res Bulwark 4, which means they could still have some sort of frontline niche that a lot of other units really aren't able to replicate at this time. And again, with the advent amount of player phase benefits versus enemy phase drawbacks, I think a lot of units are really struggling to find their footing nowadays, especially for melee flyers who are still one of the best archetypes that we currently have. A lot of teams either consist of Cavalans or just have a really good amount of DR shredding, and because a good amount of them also happen to be green, it's not really doing them a lot of favors. But otherwise, it's the addition of Candy Fighter, which can still benefit some armors if they do need to run it, and the other infantry melees that really don't have a niche pretty much are falling down because they don't really do anything that particularly well. They lack threat range, they don't really have a lot of defensive goodies, although we'll probably get more bulwarks in the future, which is still a nice buff. That being said, a lot of them do rely on speed, which is becoming increasingly more difficult with the amount of gimmicks that they continue to add to the game. If they can't really frontline and you don't have a really decent far save, then their frontline prowess isn't going to be doing a whole lot of favors for them, especially now that we have the likes of No Quarter, which gets through a lot of these melee units. And lastly, there are the arena updates, and we did get 4 new units that score relatively well for arena, those being Valentine's Vigard, Hawkeye, Mavier, and Pern. They all score relatively good in their own respect, although 2 of them only have PRFs, the other ones just have a lot more BST to compensate. And we did also get the addition of legendary male Alir, who is an Earth legendary. He's somebody that you may have to watch out for, but his miracle isn't going to be consistent in the form of AI because it has to be within 3 spaces of 3 allies, which is definitely a lot more strict than you would probably expect for a modern 2024 condition. But as far as the rest of the units are concerned, they don't really score all too well. Minerva is teetering on 758 BST, which is slightly less than a lot of the other additions that we did have. She would still have to run G-Duel Flying, which whatever, but she does have the DC Seal, which does bolster it a bit. You still have better options when it comes to scoring though, and I really wouldn't recommend it if you are specifically looking for arena score bots. The same thing could also be applied to Gangrel, who scores 756. Meanwhile, with Pern, he scores 760. He has a modern PRF and modern BST, so he's way easier to invest into, and generally has a lot more stuff going for him over Gangrel in my opinion. Ashnard also falls in a similar vein to young Minerva, who scores 758 BST, and really, again, if you are looking for a score bot, you definitely have a lot of better options. Honestly, he's probably not going to be doing a whole lot in something like Arena, but if you still need somebody for support, you could still absolutely run him in something like Wind Season because he shuts off the likes of Eliwood's bonus doubler. And Mavier is also just a decent buff bot, scores 760 BST, nothing to really worry about there, although eventually score creep will rise and we'll end up talking about 766 BST, so that's going to be fun. But otherwise, in terms of preferred seasons, I wouldn't really recommend any of them for Fire Season. I think a lot of them definitely fit more into the Water Season, Earth Season, and Wind Season. Earth Season for Gangrel and Pern in particular are really awesome because of the likes of legendary Robin roaming around. Pern has the ability to nullify any sort of penalties, which is something that Robin naturally inflicts with his weapon. Meanwhile, with Gangrel, he does shut off a single layer of Unity, which can be helpful if you are looking to secure kills in Earth Season. You also have the likes of Hawkeye and Vigard, who are pretty much just equivalents to a lot of the other units in Water Season. Hawkeye is a min-max lance infantry akin to Saizo, except he dumps his speed for a lot more res. You would pretty much be running them as all the other generics. Vigard also falls in a similar vein because he's also similar to Ludwig in that regard. He just has modern BST. He is an Axe armor, and you can still use the likes of Arcane Threma, which is a really nice tanking option. And lastly, you have the likes of Ashnard, Mavier, and young Minerva. I think Ashnard is a great benefit to the likes of Wind Season, mainly because he can shut off bonus doubler effects from Eliwood, only for attack and defense, which in my opinion is probably going to be some of the most useful ones that you can definitely do. Mainly attack, of course, because you'll be able to tank a lot more securely with him around. And for what it's worth, it's not like he doesn't score horribly, but he is relatively old, so you may not necessarily find that his scoring capabilities are all that great. But I do think if you plan to run him for arena purposes, then Wind Season is definitely the way to go. And with Mavier and Minerva, it's mainly so you could activate prime conditions with much more ease. You would be using this in tandem with Eliwood. Eliwood grants several bonuses with his weapon and C-Slut, Minerva grants an additional one with her weapon, and Mavier grants 2 with his weapon. And I think for synergy purposes, you'll end up getting a lot out of it. And really, these are the seasons I would definitely recommend them in, but the big priority definitely falls in line with scoring, and As far as scoring is concerned, Mavier, Pern, Hawkeye, and Vigard are probably going to be your best options among the Grail updates. And really, as far as units I would definitely recommend, at least from the new ones, Minerva, Vigard, and Pern are definitely up there. Minerva has really good combat and support, hence she is in the mixed utility category. Heroes with multi-purpose work well enough in most modes, to be honest. They could score well enough, they have good combat, or they have a decent defensive niche, which is why I would definitely recommend them in that regard. And for the units in the high performance tier, it's pretty much where they're the best across pretty much every single mode. The only exceptions really being Har and Cormag for scoring, even though they could still fulfill a similar amount of score to Minerva, although they do trade that out for just having incredibly good defensive capabilities, which most units cannot replicate. But as far as recommended units are concerned, I think other than them, Valadar, Larum, Eldigan are still great for mixed utility because they have decent amount of support and defensive or offensive capabilities. Flame Emperor, Murdoch, and Vigard are really good score bots and have decent enemy face niches. And Arian, Har, Cormag, and Summermail Shez can still do a lot in their own respective way. Even if it isn't just guard bearing frontline with guidance, they still have a lot of other capabilities that a lot of other units aren't replicating. And as far as the tier list updates are concerned, this is probably going to be about it. I'm saying this ahead of time, not knowing how long this video is really going to be, but this may end up being a lot longer than most of the other ones, but I did want to give it some time, mainly because I was very concerned about jumping the gun with a lot of the new additions, since a lot of the new ones were very, very big. And I'd rather play it safe than get something wrong or jump the gun on something. Better safe than sorry, and hopefully next time I'll be a lot more consistent. And the gap between this video and the next one won't be so large. But other than that, let me know what your thoughts are down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.